Hello, everyone. Good morning, and officially welcome to this month's HR Spotlight. For February, we are talking about HR skills for 2024 and beyond. It's still pretty early in the year, so marami pa tayong chance to develop the skills that will help propel us and move us to the future. Thank you so much for being here with me. I see a lot of familiar names, so a lot of you will already know me. Nice to see you all again. I love seeing you every month. But for those who are new here, let me introduce myself. You can call me Elisha. So my name's Elisha Corpus, and I actually did my master's in human resources and labor relations at Michigan State University. I did my undergrad here. I'm from UP Diliman, but right after that, I went to the US to take my master's. As you can see here, these are my classmates in our master's in HR class. And I love telling the story about my time at MSU because I think taking my master's really gave me the foundational theories, concepts, and models that allowed me to think deeply about HR. All of that I applied in Microsoft. Right after graduation, I moved from Michigan to the other side of the country, Seattle, Washington. And in Seattle, Washington, I was working with Microsoft in their global learning and development team. So global learning and development, we take care of the everything related to learning across the whole world. So all of the Microsoft employees in the whole world, we set the strategy for the way that they will experience learning. Also very special about that time was Microsoft was going through a huge culture transformation. HR was a strategic partner throughout that culture transformation, and I was lucky to be directly involved in a lot of those initiatives. I'm so excited because I get to share a lot of the things I learned over there with all of you, especially when we do these free webinars. So now I went home, came back to the Philippines late 2018 because I really realized that this is where I want to work more and share the things that I've been so privileged to experience in the US. I have a consulting firm. It's very creatively called just my name, Elisha Corpus Consulting. We specialize in culture transformation, leadership development, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. We work with all kinds of companies in different industries, all sizes as well, from companies with less than 20 employees in the nonprofit space to multinationals with thousands of employees all over the world. So we love having that range because it gives us great perspectives on what work is like in different parts of the world. That's a little bit about me. I do hope that as we go through the session and maybe in future webinars as well, I get to know more about you too. So bakit ba tayo nandito ngayon? What are we going to talk about? In this webinar, we will, number one, identify trends that are driving changes in the organizational landscape. Of course, before we identify what skills we need to learn as HR professionals, we have to align that with what is currently happening in the world. Ano ba yung nangyayari sa mundo? Ano yung trends in organizations? Para kapag naintindihan natin yun, mas magme-make sense kung ano ba yung skills na kailangan natin matutunan. Number two, our second goal for our morning would be to discuss how these changes are influencing the HR function. How is it changing the way HR is being done? And then, of course, number three, we want to identify relevant skills that HR professionals, like a majority of us, can develop to adapt. So we'll go through all three of these in our webinar. I see a question in the chat, a link for attendance. Wala pong link for attendance. It's all going to be through the form that we will share at the end of the session. All right. So let's dive right into our first part, which is looking at the state of organizations in 2024. Let's do that first by looking at your own perspectives. What are the top concerns faced by your organizations at present? So please answer that through our Mentimeter. I've pasted the link in the chat, or you can also go to www.menti.com and use the code 77027784. While you're doing that, let me head over to our Mentimeter right here. Okay. So think about ano ba yung mga issues or concerns ninyo, not just in HR, but in your companies, in your organizations as a whole. Anong mga pinoproblema ng mga tao? Baka pwede natin yun i-share sa Mentimeter. And then let's go and see if there are some commonalities in the answers. I think we can go and look at the results. It looks like a lot of you are saying employee retention is a problem, which is kind of related to the second answer here, hard to recruit talent, right? So, daming lumalabas and mahirap din kumuha ng bago. Walang budget para sa initiatives. That could be true as well because a lot of businesses are still trying to cope from the pandemic. All right. Low employee engagement, lack of clear direction, high volume of resignation, kind of related to that retention top one choice. Struggle within culture of tenured and newly hired employees. So we're seeing some traditions butting heads maybe with the newer norms. Hindi tama ang skills ng mga tao. There's a mismatch. Again, because, so it's related to something we have here. It's a mismatch because the world is changing and the skills are different. Okay? So politics, kind of related to culture, leaders not willing to follow established policies. So medyo related din siya dun sa mga norms that we already talked about. All right, so good job everyone, and thank you so much for sharing your perspectives there. We do that because what we are going to do next, so I'm just going to mute people who unmute, all right? Okay. So what we're going to do next is we're going to try to see how all of these trends can come together. We have to acknowledge that we live in a changed world and in a continuously changing world. I think if we listen to the narratives maybe a few years ago, what people are saying is that the world is changing. It's still in flux. I think now that we're in 2024, we have to make that a bit more nuanced. Totoo naman, nagbabago yung mundo. Pero dapat matanggap din natin na nagbago na yung mundo. Following, di ba? So nagbago na and nagbabago pa. I think that's different and it gives a more nuanced view of what we need to do. Because now we have to kind of accept that there are things that are so fundamentally different from how we do them in the past. And to be able to get us to the future, we have to address that. So we live in a changed and continuously changing world. There are internal and external factors that will create pressure for organizations. What are some of these internal and external factors that are the sources of change for organizations? If we look at the internal factors, we can summarize them into these 2 bullet points. First, there's a stagnation of innovation, even though we do have a lot of technological advances. You kind of see the irony there. Madami tayong bagong technology, pero maraming kumpanya na nagsasabi na hindi sila nakaka-innovate or parang nagsa-stagnate yung creativity to innovate. The second bullet point here is we are experiencing shifting mindsets and values. So nag-iiba ang pag-iisip at paggalaw ng mga tao. That's when it comes to some of the internal factors. Internal meaning these are the changes that you can see in the people that are in your companies. Externally, for the most part, these are the things that most organizations do not have direct control over. It's happening outside of their organizations. We have 2 bullet points here to summarize those external factors. We can think about them as geopolitical upheavals, and also there's this glaring need for action on environmental issues. Let's dig into these 4 bullet points so we can look at what data supports the existence of these changes. First, let's look at the internal factors, okay? So wag tayo mawawala, dun muna tayo sa internal. The first bullet point is the stagnation of innovation despite technological advances. Let's look at the data points that support that. This research that I'm showing on the slide is from a report called the Microsoft Work Trends Index 2023. Okay? What is the Microsoft Work Trends Index? This is a study that they've been doing since 2020, if I'm not mistaken. They surveyed for 2023 31,000 people across 31 countries, and they analyzed trillions of Microsoft 365 productivity data. With Microsoft being used by most corporations, they have access to the way people work using the tools that they provide, like Outlook or Teams or whatnot. The great thing about the Microsoft Work Trends report is it also includes the Philippines as part of the data set. It gives us an opportunity to see Philippine-specific numbers. All right? So yan yung data na pinagkuhanan natin. Anong sinasabi ng report? The report says that 3 in 4 people would be comfortable using AI not just for administrative tasks, so 76% said that, but also for analytical work, 79% agreed, and creative work, 73% agreed. Now, if you look at the Philippines data, that's the PH1 that you're seeing in the bracket, it's even higher than the global average. So ang sinasabi dito, sa Pilipinas, mas mataas pa yung acceptance of technology like AI compared to the average of the rest of the world. In the Philippines, 83% say that they would be comfortable using AI for admin tasks. 86% say they'd be comfortable using it for analytical work. And 85% say they'd be comfortable using it for creative work. Again, it tells us that acceptance is quite high. I think if we look at our everyday lives, hindi na surprising yun, di ba? Pag may bagong trends sa Facebook na gumagamit ng AI, sino lagi na uuna? Tayo, di ba? Think about those AI trends like yung, remember that time when you can use your phone and then you have a filter and it shows you what you will look like when you're older? Naalala niyo ba yun? So those are some examples of AI seeping into our everyday entertainment. Yun pa lang, ang dami na sa bansa natin gumawa nun. So we can see that we're pretty comfortable using new technologies. The thing though is, even if acceptance is high, we don't actually fully utilize and maximize those in ways that are beneficial to work. What do we mean? We have more data points to dig into that. In that same report, they said that 64% of people do not have enough time and energy to do their work. That means they are 3.5 times more likely to struggle with innovation and strategic thinking. In the Philippines, again, the results are even higher than the global average. 72% of Filipinos say they do not have enough time and energy to finish their work, which means that here in the Philippines, we are 5 times more likely to struggle with innovation and strategic thinking. It's a pretty sad statistic if you think about it. What this tells us is, nararamdaman natin, mga Pilipino, na wala tayong oras para gawin yung trabaho natin, and therefore, hindi tayo makapag-creative and strategic thinking. Hindi tayo maka-innovate. Hindi tayo makatawid sa mas maganda pang paraan na gawin ang mga bagay. All of this, we can encapsulate in a term called digital debt, okay? I'm going to type that in the chat box. Digital debt. What does that mean? Digital debt is the accumulated loss of profit or loss of business momentum from not adapting digital technologies. Essentially, it means that if we fail to innovate and adapt new technologies, then we are losing potential for profit or potential for business growth. It looks like for the Philippines, we have a huge amount of digital debt and it hurts us, okay? Medyo malungkot, di ba? Hindi lang malaki yung utang natin bilang bansa, malaki pa yung digital debt natin. If we think about leaders, it looks like leaders are also feeling that digital debt. Nearly 2 in 3 leaders, or about 60%, are concerned about the lack of innovation. In the Philippines, again, that's higher. 70% of leaders, they are concerned about the lack of innovation. Leaders are seeing it. If we think about how people are, the sentiment, like how worried they are about HR taking over about AI taking over their jobs, then this is the statistic that we find. 49% of people are worried that AI will take over jobs, but even if they are worried, there's still a higher percentage, around 70%, who are willing to delegate as much work as possible to AI if it can help free up their workload. In the Philippines, again, it's higher than the global average. 52% of Filipinos say they are worried AI will take over their jobs, but on the flip side, 78% are saying, oh, it's okay for me to use AI if it will help lighten my workload. Seems ironic, right? But what that can potentially tell us is that the divide is real. Again, it could tell us that the divide is real. Malaki ang gap between the people who are willing and able to use these kinds of technologies at present. If we think about the Philippines, we have a huge population doing manual labor. It means that in their industries or in their specific organizations, it hasn't reached a point where technologies are integrated into the way they do their work, which means they haven't yet seen how technology can actually be used to enrich their everyday work. That's probably why we still see 52% of Filipinos who are worried that AI will take jobs away from them. On the flip side, we have part of the population that's doing work that doesn't need as much manual labor. These are the kinds of work that maybe you can do in a computer. It's more of a thinking intensive kind of work. And for them, they are already highly accepting of these technologies. So of course, we see a higher rate of comfort to give some tasks or offload some tasks to those technologies. It's a very rich data set, right? But if you boil it down to the conclusions, just think about it in this way. Accepting tayo of technology, pero hindi natin siya fully utilize and maximize to apply into a work setting. That means we, at present, at least, we are failing at using these technologies to lighten up the workload. These technologies at present do not help provide us with more time and more energy to do innovative and strategic pieces of work. Because of that, our digital debt is growing and it is hurting our organizations. Really, that's all you have to think about when it comes to this whole body of research that we've been discussing so far. Now, another interesting part of the data set is to think about what's driving that digital debt. Saan ba nanggagaling yung ganong sentiment na wala tayong oras para gawin yung innovative kind of work? What they've done as they gathered data is they asked participants, in your current day-to-day role, rank the following 5 items based on how they disrupt your productivity. After analyzing, it seems like having inefficient meetings is the number one reason that people state. Inefficient meetings take away time from productive and innovative work. The lesson here is if we can find more intentional ways to support our employees through these, then that could help free up time for them to be more creative and innovative. This is where technology can play. If we find a way to fully maximize and utilize our technologies to address these top 5 obstacles, then that's how we can actually make the best use of them. All right? So again, what we're saying here is currently we have a lot of technological advances, but we are not yet using them to contribute to innovation. That's why we see a stagnation of innovation in companies across the world. Next up, another internal factor is the shift in mindsets and values. There's a study done by Deloitte every single year called the Gen Z and Millennial Survey. So Deloitte, they have a data set of 14,483 Gen Zs and 8,373 millennials from 44 different countries. They do this every year. That's why it's great because we get year-over-year data. All right. So why do we present this, even if it's just Gen Z and millennial? Think about it. A lot of the newer entrants are Gen Z. Actually, part of that generation is already working or graduating soon. In a few years, they are going to be the majority of your workplace. That's millennials and Gen Zs. So it makes sense to already see the sentiments of this population because they will be the majority of who we will have to manage in the future. So what are Gen Zs and millennials saying? If we look at the percentages of how important these different items are to their sense of identity, we can see that work still is quite important. I think that's different from the popular perspective. Maybe a lot of us in popular culture or just in popular articles, we say that Gen Zs and millennials don't like to work as much as older generations. But this report with actual data, it actually says that that's not true at all. Work still matters for this population. Friends and family, of course, is higher. That's consistent with the older generations. And work comes at a second place, which means people still use work as a way to inform their sense of identity. Siguro, mag-iiba lang siya when we get into the nuance of what Gen Zs and millennials want to get from work. The dataset, the participants, they were also asked if they think about the peers they admire, what are the top 5 things that impress them? The top 5 things it looks like are: number one, millennials and Gen Zs, we are impressed by having an ability to maintain a positive work-life balance. Number two, we are impressed by people who live life on their own terms. They work on something that is not bounded by societal expectations. Number three, we are impressed by people who continue learning new skills. Number four, impressed by people who are continuously reinventing themselves, whether that's new jobs or relocation or going back to school, etc. And then number five, we are impressed by people who seem to be passionate for their work. What this tells us is work isn't just for getting money or benefits or for stability. It looks like this population is looking at work as a source of these higher level needs. If you think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We want work that will be able to give that balance, work that will allow you to do something meaningful enough to transcend societal expectations, work that gives you development opportunities, work that gives you new experiences, like maybe moving to a new city or country. And we want work that allows for our passions to align with what we do. So these are the kinds of workplaces that people are already looking for and will be looking for in the future. The thing that is a bit of an issue here is, even if people are looking for that rich and fulfilling workplace, the reality is we do not have the energy and the motivation to create and even to seek for that kind of workplace. So what do we mean by that? If we look at the same survey, they also asked Gen Zs and millennials how stressed and burnt out they are. It looks like that for the most part, 36% of Gen Zs, 30% of millennials say they are exhausted or have low energy. We're tired, essentially. 35% of Gen Zs, 28% of millennials, they are actively disillusioned, meaning we feel a certain cynicism toward work. Hindi ka na naniniwala sa mga sinasabi sa'yo. For example, if your new company has a new initiative for engagement, baka sabihin mo na lang, salita lang yan, di ba? Hindi na ako sasali kasi hindi na ako naniniwala sa'yo. So 35%, 28%. 42% of Gen Zs and 40% of millennials, they struggle to perform to the best of their ability at work. They don't know what that potential looks like, and they don't always feel support to be able to get to that potential. What we can see here is that people are stressed and burnt out or on the verge of being burnt out because of various concerns. That's what makes it tricky. Because how can we create a workplace with the richness and fulfillment that we talked about earlier, that we desire, when we're so tired and unsupported? It's also good to ask, saan nanggagaling yung ganitong kind of sentiment? Bakit pagod yung mga tao? Bakit low yung energy nila? It's because these are the top concerns of Gen Zs and millennials. For both populations, cost of living is the highest concern. Gen Zs, the top two is unemployment, which makes sense because they are, for the most part, graduating and looking for employment. And then for millennials, climate change is the top two concern, because if you look at millennials, most of us are already working. Most are actually even climbing that leadership ladder already. So really able to look at the bigger societal issues happening around. These are the top concerns of these two generations. And again, we're looking at these two generations because in the next few years, sila na yung magiging majority ng mga workplace. These concerns matter because they affect a person's ability to plan for the future. Think about it. If cost of living is so high and you're earning just a bit above minimum wage, then that's not motivating because no matter how hard you work, hindi mo pa rin maa-afford yung gusto mong ma-afford. No matter how much effort you put into your work, if you don't see that the company is growing, it's impossible to ask for a raise. So how is that motivating, right? What the research tells us is that these concerns affect the ability to plan for the future. Gen Zs and millennials think it'll be harder to ask for a raise, to get a new job, to get a promotion, or even to start a family and to buy a home in the next few years. That affects a person's long-term thinking. And as we know, long-term thinking is so important for innovation. That's probably another factor contributing to that stagnation of innovation. It's a lot of data, but maybe try to think about it in this way. There has to be some sort of a give and take here. For companies, we have to pay people well, way beyond the minimum that's expected of you if you want to have the right talent. If there's a person who's the right talent that you think will help propel you to the future, you have to pay them right. You have to pay them well enough to compensate for that talent that they're giving. If your company is not able to do that, let's say your business is struggling, then there's a certain level of being upfront that you have to do with your employees so they also understand where you're coming from and what's realistic for you. On the flip side, for employees, we have to be able to show some kind of willingness to have a partnership relationship if the company is showing us some good faith in the way they deal with us. This means that if we're seeing that our companies are trying, sincerely trying, there are initiatives that they are trying to put in place, then it's also up to us to kind of work through that cynicism and find a way to partner. It's hard, right? Because it's a give and take relationship that increasingly companies and employees will have to figure out as we go through the next few years. All right, let's go to the external factors. One of the biggest external factors would be geopolitical upheavals. Geopolitical risks are real and are felt in everyday life. This is confirmed by McKinsey's research. Every year, they survey CEOs of different companies around the world. And for 2024, one of the 8 priorities of CEOs would be to really look at geopolitical risks. First, let's define terms. Ano ba yung geopolitics? It just sounds complicated, but essentially, geopolitics is an analysis of the geographic influences on power relationships in international relations. In summary, international politics lang yung ibig sabihin niyan, okay? When we say geopolitical risks, that means the influence of geopolitical factors on market behaviors. This means that we have to think about how international politics is affecting the economy and the way that our organizations can work together. One very tangible example would be supply chain and logistics. Think about it. If wars are happening in certain parts of the world and you're sourcing your materials from that part of the world, then your business is directly affected. That's one of the simplest ways to think about geopolitical risk. With this, though, it goes beyond just affecting supply chains and market share. Individually, employees feel the distress that comes from the uncertainty of these geopolitical risks. What we're seeing now in the world is that beliefs are so disjointed. Even basic fundamental beliefs like how to treat human life, it seems like nations are not agreeing on that. And so when we see that playing out on a global perspective, that can affect the mental health, emotional, mental, spiritual well-being of people around the world. So again, it goes beyond just supply chains and logistics and market share. It's the questioning of the fundamental beliefs and value of human life that can also affect individual people. Another external factor is the glaring need for action on environmental issues. What we're seeing here is that CEOs are already feeling that importance. PwC, they surveyed 609 executives in the US for 2023 about what's important for them. 50% of them said that climate change is a moderate to serious business risk. I know that it's just US data, but what usually happens in the US, multinationals, it can trickle around the world, so it's still very much relevant for us. It's not just CEOs, though, who are thinking about this problem. Even Gen Zs and millennials are struggling with thinking about environmental issues. 50% of Gen Zs, 46% of millennials, they say that they are actively pressuring businesses to take action on climate change. And that is increasing year over year. We are looking at organizations to not just have programs for sustainability, but to also actually help individuals to live that sustainability. What do we mean by that? What we know is Gen Zs and millennials are struggling with the financial resources to live a more sustainable life, and that's causing distress for them. So something that we are looking for companies to do is to provide employee subsidies for sustainable choices. Instead of just giving car allowance, maybe there's an extra tier of that for electric car subsidies. Maybe it's helping them acquire solar panels for their homes or giving people bus cards so they commute, giving service so that we lessen the number of cars on the road, etc. So nowadays, employees are also saying that they want support from the system to be able to sustain their individual behaviors. For companies, that also makes sense because it's aligning their people practices with the sustainability commitments that they are increasingly having to make. So again, there's a glaring need for action on environmental issues, and these are creating pressures for organizations. We talked about these because it's important for all of us to understand the data that we're grounding ourselves on. We are going to move into the next section, which is thinking about how these are affecting HR. But let me address some of the more logistics questions in the chat. I will give a copy of the recording, but not of the slides. In the recording, though, you'll be able to see the slides. And then again, there's no attendance link because it's something that is part of the form we are going to give at the end of the session. All right? So now that we've talked about these pressures, internal and external, let's think about what are some of the ways that these are affecting HR. So everyone in the chat, can you go ahead and please share what are some of the ways that HR is starting to respond to those internal and external shifts that we're seeing? Good question in the chat. It's across different industries. So the research, the reports that I pulled from and I mentioned earlier, it gets data from various industries, and except for the PwC one, it's a global data set. All right. So everyone, go ahead and type one word or one phrase in the chat. How do you think are all of those changes affecting HR? Or in your own experience, what are some of those ways that you're observing HR is starting to do as they respond to the shifts? All right. Yeah. So there's already a beginning push to bridge the generational gap. More and more people are interested in that. Listening to the employee pulse, yes. Kahit simple surveys lang, no? Very important na madami na o mas madami na ang gumagawa. Hiring smart, great. And this is also something that I'm so happy to do because recently I was talking to a government client, and even for the government, it sounds like they're already starting to use behavioral based interviewing and they're recruiting inter-rater ratings for selecting candidates. So I think very good that we see those institutions catching up as well. All right. So culture being something that leaders are paying more attention to. Sustainability as well. More and more leaders are actually acknowledging that they are important and not just, diba, extra ng HR. Uh-huh. There's a struggle with technology as well. I think good to point that out. Mm-hmm. And CSR, or at least a social aspect to the work that we do, is being added. Great, everyone. I think intuitively, we all know how the different changes are affecting our industry, our HR profession. So now what I want to do is to summarize that into three different points. HR in 2024 and beyond, let's discuss. Number one, HR practices must be rehauled to align with a changed world. Essentially, because the world has changed and is changing, we have to accept that HR also must change. This is tricky because even though we know all of these things about HR and the world we live in right now, there are still so many companies and HR leaders that are living in a more traditional sense of HR. But we have now arrived at a point in time, even after the pandemic, it's the 2020s, it's a point in time when organizations have fundamentally changed, which means that HR must also fundamentally change with it. What I'm showing you here is a screenshot from a webinar by Josh Bersin. So Bersin is a very, very well-known firm that is kind of like a gold standard when it comes to HR. They research on a lot of best practices and teach that to HR professionals. One of their webinars on YouTube, I'll link it later, don't worry. So in one of their webinars, they say that now that we're in the 2020s, the kind of way that HR operates must be aligned with this intelligence age. I know that not everyone here maybe had an educational background in HR, so let's just quickly go through the history here that we're seeing on the slide. If we think about the history of work, that starts all the way in the agrarian age. Think about that age when people were farmers or trade workers. Di ba yung stereotype nun is, imagine nyo yung mga lumang movie, lalo na yung mga European na lumang movie, tapos may mga castle yung mga tao, di ba? And ang mga population, nakatira sila inside those castle walls for the most part. Medyo ganon. Think about like farming being one of the highest like jobs people do. People took up a trade or a craft. So kung yung buong pamilya mo gumagawa ng swords, that becomes your craft. If your whole family are they're artists, that becomes your craft as well. So medyo ganon ang way of working. People died early, and companies, quote unquote, wala pang formal companies, but the places or organizations that people work in, they tend to live for 100+ years. Kasi nga, generation after generation, they go into that same trade or that same craft. That's the agrarian age. And then we get into the 1920s industrial age. The biggest thing that happened here is nagkaroon ng mga factories. So ito na yung start nung ginagawa ng assembly line. We're able to create and manufacture different products. Think about like Ford, for example, and how they are able to manufacture cars in an assembly line. So yun yung naging method of working. People moved from faraway towns to go into cities where these big plants and factories are. Dahil doon, dahil eksakto yung work na ginagawa ng mga tao, naging automated din yung mga assembly line. Sometimes all one person has to do every day is get one piece of the car and put it where it has to go. So yun lang yung trabaho niya for the whole day. Things became kind of mechanic in that sense. What we can see here is that people died in their 50s. So medyo gumanda yung quality of life. Kasi nga we got new technologies that could prolong life. And companies or formal organizations started to form and they lived 50+ years. Think about Ford, the GM, these car companies, legacy organizations that most are still alive up to today. So that's the industrial age. Now we get into the 1970s, which is when we start beginning to see computers. So 1970s, not yet the computers that we see today, but those technologies are starting to pop up. And then, of course, as we know, 1990s is when that really boomed into like internet and democratic use of the internet and computers. So that's what we call the information age. In the information age, it's the tech companies that really dominated. We traded in data. That's what became important. So these are the early versions of the tech companies, like your IBM. They're more computer companies, if you will. The thing about the information age is, again, life expectancy got longer, and the companies, though, their life expectancy got shorter to about 20 to 30 years. It's ironic, di ba? Habang humahaba yung buhay ng mga tao, umiikli yung lifespan ng mga kumpanya. Why is that? There's more competition. It's a harder market to sustain being in because of the newer technologies coming. If you don't adapt, then you're dead and you cease to exist as a company. And then now we are in the intelligence age. It's a step above information because it's not just the raw data that we're able to collect and analyze. Now it's really about how do we use all this information in intelligent ways? How do we use this information in ways that will actually help lives and help us propel our lives into the future? So now the dominant industries are the tech companies as we know it today. It's more of your Googles, Microsoft, etc. And what we're seeing is that people are living longer, but the companies that can provide them with work are living shorter. The average lifespan of a company these days is 10 to 15 years. Again, because of various reasons, but mostly we can see that it's because the changes are happening so fast. And the companies that fail to learn and adapt, they also cease to exist. So that's a brief history. And I think it's important to understand that because it tells us that some of the HR practices we have now, they came all the way from the industrial age. Ang tagal na since nangyari yun. And so much has changed. So we also have to accept that we need to change. If we kind of briefly track the changes in HR, in the beginning, it was just paying people, dealing with labor, and staffing. So ito yung, think about industrial age or kahit agrarian age even. It's just making sure na may taong gumagawa ng kailangan gawin. During the industrial age, like towards the tail end of it, we also started to see the movement, the beginning of human-centered movements. Ito na rin yung start of the appearance of IO-Psych kasi, or different like time and motion studies that really tried to figure out safety of people. So that's really where it started. Well-being was treated more around safety and engaging employees to be able to work longer hours to produce more things. And then, of course, as we improved more, think about the information age, HR got smarter in a sense. Now we realize that we can do work efficiently if we have a service delivery model, meaning we pool work together, we group some of the common work together so we can efficiently provide them by batch. So parang ganun yung pwede nating way of thinking about it. And then now that we are in this age of intelligence, and that's the kind of expectation from us, we're seeing HR work revolving more around culture, diversity and inclusion, and also human-centered work. So again, this slide is just telling us some of the ways HR has shifted to align with the history of how work has played out in the world. So that is number one, HR practices have to be rehauled. Number two, a systemic approach to HR is important now more than ever. This is something that Burson also shared in their webinar. They are terming the new way that HR has to work as systemic HR. So again, systemic HR is the term they are using for how HR has to operate now in the current environment we're in. If we think about systemic HR, they created a 4-level maturity model. Ang sinasabi ng maturity model na to is, ito yung levels of how HR operates. Level 1 is transactional compliance. Think about it as HR is focused on more admin stuff, if you will, like hiring and just really getting like resumes, for example. Or when it comes to payroll, it's not really a strategic point of view of payroll, but it's just getting people the payments. Diba? Yun lang. It's more of just complying with the minimum standards that the laws are telling organizations they have to do. So again, transactional is just the basic level of HR. It's the traditionally admin way of thinking about it. The next level is efficient service delivery. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but this is where HR starts to pool their resources. In level 1, we notice that there are many activities that are being replicated throughout the organization. For example, siguro more than 5 people are asking about their payroll and they are asking different HR professionals. When it comes to efficient service delivery, what we're saying is, kung ganun pala yung sitwasyon, hindi ba mas okay na meron tayong isang dedicated group na pwedeng pagtanungan ng mga ganong payroll questions para lahat ng tanong sa kanila pupunta. So now it's more efficient as you deliver that service. In companies nowadays, they call it like business services. So think about yung mga business service models. medyo ganun yung sinasabi natin dito with service delivery. The thing about this, though, is HR becomes just like a support function. Yes, you may be doing your work efficiently, but at the end of the day, it's just supporting the strategic goals of the company. What we want is for the company to realize that HR should be a part of that strategy and not just supporting it. So then we go to the next level, level 3. Level 3 is solution centric. What happened here is HR realized that if we want to be part of the strategy, we have to be able to provide solutions, strategic solutions to the organization. So, for example, if HR noticed that, hey, data across the company is kalat or all over the place, maybe we need an HRIS or some sort of a system as a solution. So now what HR did is we have project managers for specific solutions like HRIS or a specific solution like a global learning strategy and how to implement core and common skills. So it's solution centric, meaning we think of something, an initiative, and assign that to an HR person or group of people to be able to create that product and guide the organization as they use that. So that's level 3. Now, there's a higher level or level 4. Level 4 is systemic and problem-oriented. Level 4 takes solution-centric to a higher level. In level 4, HR is like a consulting firm. They don't just create solutions and sell that, quote unquote, to the different departments and units. What they do is they actually go to the different parts of the company and say, what is going on here? What are your goals? What are the gaps blocking you from those goals? How can we use people practices to unblock those and fill the gaps? So it's a consulting effort where you're trying to look at what the core problems are so you can create interventions and solutions for it. I hope you notice the subtle difference. Solution-centric is creating something and just pushing it out to the organization versus level 4, problem-oriented and systemic HR, is actually hearing about what is going on in the organization, what is the strategy that gets us to the future, to thrive in the future, and then creating ways for HR to play in that. In level 4, HR has an HR strategy that is being sponsored by and actively participated in by other leaders. HR people also have consulting skills. So they are able to ask those good questions and have an equal partnership with the leaders around them. If we look at the distribution, where are HR groups around the world located? 89%. If you add up all of these levels 1, 2, 3, 89% of companies in the world are not in level 4. Only 11% of companies are able to reach that. This tells us that for the most part, a lot of the HR work around the world is still not to the best in class level that we can reach. If you look at the distribution, the biggest one is actually still in transactional compliance. So in reality, it seems like hindi pa nakakahabol yung madaming HR groups around the world. So that's systemic HR. Now, I'm curious to know, so I'm going to the next slide here on Mentimeter. This is all anonymous, so I won't know what your answers are. But in the Mentimeter, could you please let us know, where would your current HR fall in terms of the maturity levels? Is it in transactional, efficient service delivery, solution centric, or are you at systemic HR? There are no right or wrong answers. And again, it doesn't mean that you're failing if you're in level one, right? It just means that there are opportunities that maybe your organization hasn't utilized just yet. So I'll see your answers first, then I'll tell you what my personal observations are given the HR people that I work with. All right, pretty accurate if we think about the Bersin study, diba? Majority level 1, very konti level 4. All right. So I'm going to tell you now that so it's accurate that a lot of companies I observe are in number 1, transactional compliance, but what they're doing is they request for a lot of solution-centric efforts. So I'll repeat that. A lot of companies are still in number 1, transactional compliance, but they request for a lot of solution-centric efforts. Meaning, they just think that one thing can solve all of their problems. And that's hard because even if we create so many solutions, if we don't figure out how to be efficient in delivering the basics of what HR has to do, then those solutions will not be sustainable and will be very difficult to follow through. So that's something that I find quite frustrating, to be honest, that even though a lot of companies are still in the compliance stage, leaders are asking for solution-centric interventions without providing the necessary budgets, time, and effort that it takes to first create efficiency in the systems and processes of HR. So yun siguro yung pwede ko i-share that I'm seeing. I think it looks like medyo pareho naman yung nakikita nyo sa nakikita ko. All right. So again, it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing if we're not all in level 4. The maturity model just tells us where we can go. It can give you kind of a guide to think about how to improve and develop HR. What I'm showing now to close up this whole discussion on systemic approaches is that it's different per industry. So the webinar that I mentioned earlier, this is a screenshot directly from there. That's why it looks like that. It's not very clear because it's a direct screenshot. I'm sharing the YouTube video here in the chat. You can watch that on your own time. But essentially, what this tells us is, depending on the industry, we can see that there are differences in the levelings that they find themselves in. So that might be interesting for you to dig into and look for your own industry there. All right. And then last is, leaders have to be activated to ensure that people practices are felt on the ground. HR cannot and should not own the work solely. Ibig sabihin, hindi pwedeng tayo lang ang gumagalaw when it comes to these people practices. It has to be owned by the leaders as well. That's why developing leaders and managers is actually the most impactful thing that we can do as HR professionals. Again, this is a screenshot from that webinar. And what this tells us is, if we look at the high impact work that HR can do, when we develop leaders and the managers, that can potentially create changes and positively impact the organization in faster ways. It makes sense, right? If you multiply the work that you do and have the leaders do that for their own people, then more people will experience the HR changes that you're implementing. Another reminder here that we're seeing from McKinsey's study is that CEOs and organizations in general have to learn to love middle managers. Middle managers are usually ignored. But if we think about it, they are the bridge that will help the organization to reach the levels, the majority of your organization. So we really need to rethink how we utilize those middle managers and to treat them as a strategic core of the company. To summarize, these are the three ways that the changes, internal and external factors, are influencing HR. Okay? So now, let's talk about skills. If these are the things that are currently happening in HR or will continuously happen in the future, what are the skills that we have to build? So, first, I'm curious to know what are the skills that you are currently prioritizing to develop as HR professionals? Maybe we can type that in the chat. Anong skills yung mga ngayon tinitake nyo na as training or tinatry nyo i-take as training? Maybe we can share some of that in the chat. Data-driven, agile, communication, yes. Adaptability, yep. So these are all in the top list of LinkedIn Learning in-demand skills for 2024. Great to see. All right. So great, everybody. I think these are all very, very important skills. But what I'd like to do now is to encapsulate them in sort of bigger level skills so that you can see how the things that you're currently developing could be used for even more strategic skills in the future, okay? Because a lot of the things you're mentioning are elements of these skills that I'm going to mention. So first, why? Why do we need to invest in HR? If your leader asks you, so bakit ba kailangan mo mag-training? Ito yung isa nating pwede gawing reason. Josh Bersin, in one of their studies on HR capabilities, they found that companies that have best-in-class HR functions are 5.5 times more likely to be more profitable and 6 times more likely to be innovative. Having good HR can directly lead to more profitable and more innovative companies. So now, what are those HR skills that are important? Number one, systems thinking. So what is systems thinking? Systems thinking is an approach to problem solving that looks at the big picture or the wider dynamic systems at play. Think about the iceberg model, super classic HR model that gets repeated all the time. Having a systems thinking approach means that you're not just looking at the part of the iceberg above water. Alam mo na ang bulk ng iceberg na yon ay nasa ilalim ng tubig, kaya marami ka pang kailangan i-uncover. That's what we mean by systems thinking. To apply that is understanding the relationships and interdependencies among different components in the organization. All right? So again, systems thinking is looking at that big picture. What are some actionable steps that you can do to show that systems thinking? First, ask 5 whys. Show an awareness for root causes. Kapag ka may nagsabi sa'yo, for example, na leader na, gawin mo tong initiative na to for HR. We don't just say, okay, I will do it. We want to be able to show that we understand the root causes. So we ask them, bakit yan yung naisip mo na initiative? Bakit yan yung na-observe mo? Bakit mo naman nasabi na yan yung nangyari? So keep on asking why until you get to a possible root cause. It shows the organization that you are looking at the system as a whole. So the 5 whys is sort of the tool or the model that's very popular for that root cause analysis. I encourage you in your own time to map out all of the HR activities happening in your organization. What do I mean by this? What I mean is sit down and get a piece of paper. Make a list of all of the HR things that you're doing and that your HR group is doing in your organization. Once you have that list, try to bucket them. Ano ba dito yung mga related sa isa't isa? It's a good exercise because it helps us to see kung ano ba yung misalignments that are potentially happening. As you go through the thought exercise, you're going to see that there are initiatives na nauulit, pare-pareho yung goal, or maybe there are some initiatives that are not so useful actually. So maybe we don't need to be doing them. So really give yourselves that time to study HR in your organization. And then another last actionable step is to think through the alignment of HR activities with business priorities. I see some people said business acumen in the skills that they're learning. That's great because business acumen is part of systems thinking. We have to be able to understand how our business gets profit, how our products and our services get done, so that we can align HR with that. So that is systems thinking. Next, skill number 2, internal consulting. What is internal consulting? It's a very long definition, everyone, so please bear with me. I'm going to read it, and I encourage you to read along with me. All right? So, an internal consultant is an employee whose role is to help the business improve. They do this by developing and implementing strategies designed to improve specific parts of the business. Internal consultants typically have a wide knowledge base about the industry in which they work, which allows them to identify areas where the business could improve. The key thing to note here is the person is doing consulting, but they are an employee. So essentially, ang clients mo ay yung organization na pinagtatrabahuhan mo, but you're using consulting skills. How can we apply that? Here are some actionable steps. Number 1, set up habits that will help you to learn about the latest trends and research in people practices. It helps to have the words to use to describe the different improvements we have to do. That's why I enjoy doing these sessions because the research that I do, I can share with you. I encourage you, though, to find ways to really infuse that learning in your own practices. For example, dun sa YouTube ni Josh Bursin, mag-subscribe kayo and turn the notifications on so that every time there's a new video, you get notified. You can look at different newsletters, like McKinsey sends newsletters almost every day with different organizational trends. So these are things you can do so that you're giving yourselves the opportunity to learn. Even if you don't watch the videos every single day, at least nandun siya, di ba? Nakukulitan ka para ma-prompt ka to take that learning in. That's a hack I do for myself, actually. I always turn my notifications on so that if it's there, like I get reminded that, oh, kailangan ko pa yun panoorin. And then I feel better after because I learned something new. Create time for data gathering before jumping into solutions. A lot of you said that data analysis or analytics is something you're learning, so you can use that for internal consulting. You also want to be able to put some simple data gathering methods in place for your companies. It can be simple annual satisfaction surveys or culture surveys, just some way to get them to practice having that data. So that's number 2, internal consulting. Number 3 skill, and the last one, is influencing even without authority. There's no definition because it's pretty self-explanatory. It's about being able to influence leaders even if they don't report directly to us. Even if most of the time, in reality, hindi naman talaga masyadong mataas yung HR in most of the traditional companies around. So how do we do that? Here are some actionable steps I suggest for you. First, set some people priorities in alignment with the department or team's goals, especially in the beginning of the year. Take time to understand what that team is trying to do and then align your HR activities with those goals. Build relationships with your stakeholders. Have one-on-ones with the people in the different units. If you're an HR business partner, for example, have one-on-ones with the different leaders that you support. Have lunch with them so that you can understand better what their concerns are and who they are as people. And then another thing that you can do to influence without authority is to do the basics very, very well. This is something we cannot escape. Kasi nga naman, how will you be able to say that HR is advancing kung hindi nababayaran on time yung mga tao, di ba? That will give your credibility a hit. So you have to be able to do the basics really well, gain credibility from that, and use that credibility to propel you into further innovations and advancements in HR. So that's it, everyone. 3 skills: systems thinking, internal consulting, and influencing even without authority. I know that maraming iba-ibang skills, di ba? Like kayo, madami kayong skills na inaaral. But what I encourage you to do is to think about how those skills can work together. Don't just take one workshop at random. You have to be able to say that I'm taking this workshop because it helps me become a better internal consultant. Or I'm learning this skill because it helps me with systems thinking. So dapat ina-anchor natin siya dito sa 3 skills that will be important in creating a systemic model of HR. All right, that is actually it, everyone, for our webinar. If you think about the journey we've been on, we grounded ourselves on what is happening in the world of work nowadays. Because of those factors, they affected HR. So we looked at what is happening in HR. And then from there, we aligned with what skills will help us to be able to adapt to what is happening in HR. So sana nakita natin yung pagtatahi na yun as we went through our session today. And with that, last thing for everyone, what will you immediately do to apply the lessons learned from this morning so that we can be sure that we will leave this morning with something? What will you do to apply? Great, I love it. Review the notes, diba? Dahil madami tayong pinag-usapan, I'm sure marami pa kayong matututunan if you review your notes back. Oh, I love this one. Reevaluating ourselves. Being real, right? With like, what can I do? What don't I know yet? That's a way to get into what you need to learn more in the future. I think that's a great way to put it. Sharing with other staff, yes, please. So we usually release the recording within 1 week, sometimes earlier. It depends on the other workload we have. So that's a YouTube link usually, and you can share that with your staff as well. Present to higher management. Yes, hopefully that's something that can help get sponsorship for you as well. Okay, so everyone, thank you so much for sharing your learnings there and the things that you will do in the chat. People might be wondering, bakit patapos na, walang Q&A? This is something that we do here. This is the kind of way that we conduct our webinars. So in the next minute, I'm going to give you some instructions for the certificate. And for people with no questions, you can leave. You can go and hopefully have your early lunch. But for people with questions, we stay behind. So ganun namin siya ginagawa para you can make the best use of your time. All right. So to summarize, number 1, Kailangan tanggapin na natin na nagbago na yung mundo and magbabago pa siya. We live in a changed and continuously changing world. Number 2, because the world is changed and continuously changing, HR must move to a more agile and problem-oriented approach. Josh Bersin called this systemic HR. So we have to have a more consulting kind of relationship with our organizations. And then number 3, individual HR professionals must innovate on the basics to gain credibility for future innovations. We have to do the basics right so that we gain more credibility to advance HR to the future. Hopefully, these are 3 things you can remember from today. What's next? Please stay connected with us. I pasted our Facebook and LinkedIn link there in the chat. I'd love to connect with you and hear more from you in the future. Number 2, please answer the evaluation form. We will have it open for 2 hours. And that evaluation form will be the basis for the certificates. So please, everyone, do not forget to answer the evaluation form. It's pretty short. And again, this is the only way we will know if you were here. And this is the only way we will know the name that you want for the certificate. So please, wag maliin ang pangalan and wag maliin ang email. We've had issues with that in the past. All right? And then lastly, next month, our free webinar is focusing on Women's Month. And we are going to talk about the state of working mothers in the Philippines. But it's not just for mothers or for women, okay? So this is for everyone, because whether you're a mother or not, whether you're identifying as a woman or not, these are kinds of insights that are very, very useful for organizations. So please, we look forward to having you there with us next month. I have an anthropologist. Her research is actually on working mothers in the Philippines. Kaya makakarinig tayo ng academic and practical perspective on it. All right? So again, everyone, sending that link again for the evaluation form. Please, do not forget to answer. And with that, that is it for this morning. So thank you so much for learning with me and for being so active in the chat. I always love learning with all of you. If you do not have any more questions, please feel free to leave the call. Have a great rest of your week.